Welcome, everybody. I am Anne Millarb, class of 1981, an Exeter survivor and one of the founding members of PATH, PEA Alumni for Truth and Healing. I want to thank the many incredible and generous alumni who donated to make this and all we do happen. Please know how grateful we are to you. I also want to express my gratitude to the many PATH members who work together to create this and other opportunities. PATH was founded by survivors for survivors, although we have many members and supporters now who have not experienced sexual abuse. Our group has changed over the years since members first started advocating for survivors' needs in 2016, after the school called for alumni sexually harmed during their Exeter experience to come forward. Re-engaging with past abuse is often distressing and isolating, and PATH has offered those who carry this experience a place to feel safe among community. We formally organized in early 2018. We support survivors from recent years to decades back, with only adversarial options available to survivors to receive ongoing therapy funds through the school. PATH offsets such costs for survivors through our Survivor Support Fund, made possible by many generous donors. We provide survivor support circles to bring survivors together and lead facilitated community circles to engage interested alumni in dialogue. We advocate for non-adversarial solutions for survivors needing acknowledgement and repairs from the Academy, and trauma-informed processes and trauma-trained professionals in the Dean's Office. Among our many endeavors, we have circulated petitions, participated in in-person meetings with administrators and trustees, provided resources to our school and to survivors, successfully testified at New Hampshire hearings on statutes of limitation, and provide statements to the press when advocacy was needed. In the end, it is from our Exeter alumni community where we have found our greatest support. We believe that prevention in the future depends on understanding and addressing the past. We work with our Exeter community to support those harmed to get past their abuse. And from the truth of our own experience, we work to name the injustices we want no community to ever get past. Please visit our website, exeterpath.com, to see more of our work and consider supporting PATH and donating to our Survivor Fund. PATH works to the best of its capacity to address the issues that Dr. Herman has identified and written about in her book, Truth and Repair, a culmination of her life's work as a psychiatrist, a researcher, a teacher, and an author. At PATH, we hope to build a better model, a better path to address the needs of survivors and the community and their community at schools like Exeter. And we sincerely hope that Exeter will join PATH and embrace the good work we are doing. I would like now to introduce Dr. Judith Lewis Herman. And she is a professor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. She was the recipient of the Lifetime Achievement Award for the International Society for Traumatic Stress Studies and is a Distinguished Life Fellow of the American Psychiatric Association. She lives just down the road from us, from Exeter, in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I will turn it over to Judith in just a second. I also want to let you know, after Dr. Herman finishes speaking, Dr. Cheryl Shakeshaft will join Dr. Herman for a dialogue between the two of them. And Dr. Cheryl Shakeshaft is a professor in the School of Education at Virginia Commonwealth University. She has been studying school employee sexual misconduct since the 1980s. In addition to her research, she has served as an expert witness in more than 400 civil cases where a student has been the target of school employee sexual misconduct or peer sexual misconduct. I look forward to this program, and with that, I turn it over to Dr. Herman.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. I'm delighted to be part of the good work that you are doing and to learn about it. I'm going to start with a slide presentation that based on my new book, Truth and Repair. Doesn't address all the questions that you sent me directly, but I think it gives a foundation of the sort of a conceptual foundation from which one can build, hopefully. To write this book, I interviewed 30 survivors of gender violence of various sorts, childhood abuse, both physical and sexual, sexual assault, sexual harassment, sexual trafficking, domestic violence, and all of the above sometimes. One of the unfortunate facts that's been well documented is that people who've been abused in childhood are at 2 to 4 times as greater risk for subsequent victimization. My informants were 26 women, 4 men, quite diverse in terms of age, class, background, gender identification, and religious background. What have I left out? Ethnicity, race. But they were, it wasn't a random sample that was, I just kind of put out the word that I was interested in interviewing survivors on their views of justice. So the group was in general more highly educated than the general population. But, and I asked them the question that nobody ever seems to ask survivors, which is, if you could write the script, what would make things right, or as right as possible for you? What would justice look like? About half of these folks had actually had encounters with the justice system, either civil or criminal. That's a much, much higher percentage also than the general population of survivors. So they spoke from experience. The book is really based on their testimony. But I start off with comparing 2 different types of power relationship, one of dominance and subordination, and one of mutuality or equality. Because whether you're in the political sphere or the sphere of work or education or the private sphere of the family and intimate relationships, these 2 types of relationships are found everywhere. The relationship of dominance and subordination is about power over. The strong do as they please, the weak have to submit, and the bystanders stand by. They don't do anything. And under those circumstances, basically there is no justice. There may be courts, there may be laws, but there's no justice. Here's a slide that these data are from the 1990s, but they're basically unchanged, which is why I haven't updated the slide. The United Nations now has a special rapporteur on violence against women, which is the most common human rights violation in the world. And she talks about the culture of impunity that is found worldwide, where basically wherever there is a patriarchal system, which is most parts of the world, ultimately the power of one group over another is enforced by violence. And so that's why we have the kind of impunity that we have. And these are maximum estimates for based on what we now have is quite good epidemiology of sexual assault. And we also have information about what % of survivors actually report to report to anybody, to the authorities. And here you see between 25 and 30% reported. I think it's more like between 20, 25, but that's a max estimate. And then what you see here is an exponential decay curve. So that by the time you have cases cleared by arrest, cases prosecuted, cases resulted in a conviction and a prison term, which is the metric of justice in our criminal justice system, you're maximum 5%, which means 95% of sexual assaults are not addressed by the criminal justice system. And of course, if you're talking about abuse of children, it's even higher. In contrast, here are the rules for relationships of equality or mutuality: respect, voice, decisions made by mutual consent, power and responsibilities are shared, and principles of fairness govern relationships. And basically, if you read philosophers of justice like John Rawls, or just look in the dictionary for the definition of justice, it all comes down to fairness and a sense that people are being treated and respected equally. But in every, when laws are broken, when people are exploited or harassed or assaulted, there are three parties to the transaction. There is the perpetrator, there's the victim, and there are the bystanders. And remember, under the rules of tyranny, the bystanders know to, they don't want to stick their necks out. They know to just look the other way. Or they collaborate with the person in power, and because oftentimes that's the way to get ahead. And so there is no such thing as a moral community. But if you're going to have a justice system, then you have to have a sense among members of the community that the moral code will be respected, and that when the person's trust is violated, the bystanders will gather to support the victim and to hold the perpetrator accountable. And in some ways, our criminal justice system supposedly recognizes that, in the sense that something like a sexual assault is processed, or for any crime, the state is considered the injured party. The victim is just a witness, because the state the community is harmed when one member harms another. That's the philosophy, but it doesn't in practice work that way, because in fact, the interest of the state and the interest of the survivor, as we will see, often do not coincide. This is a quote from a book by Ross London. He is someone who, in his legal career, has been a prosecutor, a defense attorney, and a municipal court judge. And he's written a wonderful book called crime punishment and restorative justice. And he invokes the concept of the moral community as the basis for his recommendations about how restorative processes could become more than a niche approach to justice. When the moral community fails, people feel terribly betrayed. And oftentimes, as you'll see from the testimony, the betrayal of the bystanders feels like a worse, if anything, equal or worse betrayal than that of the perpetrator. Because when the bystanders don't come to the survivor's support, the survivor's isolated. So here's a quote from an informant talking about the betrayal in her family. And here's a quote from a woman who was raped as a college student, who did go to the police, and then her case was not accepted for prosecution because it was an acquaintance rape, somebody she met at a party, which is like, I mean, the only rapes that really count in the criminal justice system in terms of prosecution being interested are if a young blonde virgin is raped by a Black stranger, basically. Those cases are vanishingly rare. Most people are raped by people they know. Most white girls are raped by white men, etc. In fact, white on Black sexual assault is much more common than, and has been throughout our history, than the other way around. But it's the institutional betrayal, as I'm sure many of you have experienced, that is so hurtful. And whether that's the DA's office or whether that's the school administration or whether that's the family, it's the inaction of the bystanders that really hurts. Here's a testimony from another survivor I interviewed. She says basically, and again, she's someone who did go to court, civil court in this case, both dealing with restraining orders and then divorce. And she basically said, be prepared to throw any illusions of justice you might have had out the window. It's not a high recommendation about the current justice system that we have. And this is, I think, because in one way of looking at it is if you wanted to design an environment that was guaranteed to exacerbate symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, a court of law would do very well. Come back. Victims need sick protection. Going to court means all kinds of risk. Victims need acknowledgement. Going to court means an adversarial encounter with somebody who's going to challenge your credibility, and instead of treating you with dignity, is going to try to humiliate you. Victims need to have a sense of agency and control, but you're at the mercy of the court's rules and procedures, which you may or may not understand. victims need, when they're ready to address the trauma, they need to have a chance to give a personal narrative rather than be peppered with yes or no questions. Until they're ready to, on their own timetable, most survivors want limited exposure to trauma reminders, which are going to precipitate nightmares and flashbacks. Instead, they have to confront the perpetrator. And nevertheless, I think a lot more survivors would be willing to endure this if the outcome that the courts offered was something they really wanted. But in fact, as we'll talk about in a minute, what most survivors most want is preventing future harm. They're not that interested in punishment. They're not, some people could definitely use monetary damages, but that's not the big motivation. It's not what they really want for the most part. So you can see why most people don't report. So here's a summary of what my 30 informants told me. And of course, they weren't all unanimous on everything. There was a range of wishes expressed. But what they were all unanimous about was that they wanted acknowledgement. That was step one. And they wanted acknowledgement, not just of facts, but the acknowledgement of the harm. Because a lot of times, if denial isn't working for the perpetrator, she's crazy, she's made this all up. Then the next is, so it's over. What's the big deal? Why is she still whining now? Or he, or they. And they want the acknowledgement, not just from the perpetrator, in fact, not even primarily from the perpetrator, but from the community, from the bystanders. And they want the community to acknowledge the facts and the harm and to vindicate them, to say, you didn't do anything wrong, that it's not your fault, this should never have happened to you. And we're sorry we let you down. And they want the community to denounce the crime and denounce the perpetrator. They want the shame lifted from their shoulders and put on the shoulders of the perpetrator where it belongs. So this is what everybody agreed on. People were very mixed about apologies. This next section in blue were, sort of some people yes, some people no. But some people really did want an apology. Very few people got one. And again, they often wanted apologies, not necessarily from the perpetrator, but from the bystanders who looked the other way, who enabled, who colluded with the perpetrator. They want fair restitution, and oftentimes, though that can take very different forms. One rape survivor, for example, wanted a lot of people don't want money from the offender because they feel like it's dirty money. So one survivor of rape wanted the offender to give $30 to the local rape crisis center. And that represented the 30 pieces of silver for which Jesus was betrayed. He actually had a lot more money than that. By the way, he paid the $30. This is someone whose criminal case, again, was turned down because it was acquaintance rape. She had actually dated the guy. But she went to civil court, and so restitution, prevention of future harm was the big one. And but they wanted the community to rally to both expose the offender and denounce the crime and do whatever was necessary to prevent him from doing it again. So removing him from positions of power, whatever it took. But they, in fact, there was no one size fits all. They weren't big on punishment, as I've mentioned. Not that many people wanted to see their perpetrators in prison, unless they thought that that was really the only way to contain him. So some of the people, there were actually 6 of the 30 people who had gone through all the way through a criminal trial to a conviction and a prison term. And they were, even people who said they were not generally in favor of prison, were in favor of this because they said, I've seen how dangerous this guy was. I knew he would do it again. And sometimes that was their motivation, really, for going through the whole criminal process, was saying, if I ever found out that he did it to somebody else because I was too chicken, I couldn't live with myself. And others said, if somebody else had come forward before, maybe this would never happen to me. Many people had revenge fantasies, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. Mostly they didn't like their revenge fantasies, but they felt, it was sort of part of their post-traumatic stress. They were also not big on forgiveness, and I'll talk a little bit more about why not. So here's some quotes from survivors about acknowledgement. So this is what he did to another human being. This is, I think, I want people to know that is kind of pretty much as plainly as plain spoken as one can be. This is another survivor who, again, felt it was important to state the fact that she was a human being. Kate Price, who was a survivor of both incest and trafficking, she was pimped by her father to truckers in Appalachia. They would, pre-internet, they would use their, what do you call the truck signaling from one truck to another. I would want their families to know. Maybe they should write a letter to their families and tell the truth. Chait was a survivor of sexual abuse in a boys' choir by the choir director who abused multiple boys. And by the time, here's someone who had dissociative amnesia and delayed recall. As an adult, his recall was corroborated by multiple other victims. And they did go to criminal court, but the statute of limitations had expired, so they couldn't press charges. Then he went to civil court, which, and the perpetrator had already gotten out of town, so he didn't show up. So he just he just testified in court for the judge to determine damages. And he said, it was $500,000 damages that he never was going to actually get. But he said it really meant a lot to him because the system acknowledged the harm. This is a bit of artwork by Amy Bradford, the survivor I told you about, who wanted the 30 pieces of silver. And this is a painting she did about her revenge fantasies. A lot of survivors feel tormented by their revenge fantasies, as though the hatred and viciousness of the perpetrator was like a foreign body that had been implanted in their brains. So here's her graphic description of her wanting to shoot the guy. And then in the back, and then this is her crying. And in the background are pictures of all the victims of gun violence in Massachusetts that year. So, and by the way, one of the wonderful things about trauma survivor support groups is that, especially in the what we call stage 2 groups, where people really get into talking about their experience, is that people share their revenge fantasies, and they get sillier and sillier, and they end up just roaring with laughter. Because they amplify them. They say, don't just stop there. Let's let it all out. I have found that relatives are not so squeamish about their revenge fantasies. Here's Bill Bradford, Amy Bradford's husband, who'd been in the military and was an attorney, and he said, I wish I had killed him. No, it already. I don't even call him a human being. But then I said, well, but suppose he apologized. Suppose he admitted everything and came and apologized to you and Amy. And he thought about it, and he, this kind of light bulb went on over his head, and he said, if he would really apologize, I think that would, I'm tired of being so angry. And but here's the reason so many survivors didn't want to hear from here's a survivor of incest by her brother. She said, it would feel fine because I bet he would enjoy talking about it. And then if he apologized, then I would, because it's in the family, I would feel pressure to forgive him. And she didn't want to do that. So, and here's another rape survivor, and who was a minister's daughter, and a very actively practicing Christian. But she said, I don't want, no, she didn't want to go there. She said, he needs his creator's forgiveness. He doesn't need forgiveness from me, and I don't want to confront him. She is one of the ones who actually did go to court, and because, in fact, this was a Black stranger who talked his way into her apartment, saying his car had broken down, could he use the phone? And she was a minister's daughter named Mary Margaret. He was convicted and sentenced to prison, and he actually died in prison. And interestingly, she she talked about that she hoped that he had found a higher power and that he had found peace. And she actually went to his funeral and sat outside. And that, you know, she didn't want to disturb the family, but she was glad that he had family who came to his funeral. And she just sort of felt that she could let go of her fear at that point. Here's another minister, a survivor of domestic violence, who started an interfaith partnership trying to educate clergy about, you know, that if your parishioner is saying, you know, she's being beaten up at home, it's not a good idea to just say, you know, you got to turn to the other cheek and keep the family together, which is what a lot of clergy do. And she says, you know, rather than, it's too easy to pressure victims to forgive. That's the easy way out. We need to think about what we need to do to actually make perpetrators remorseful and change their behavior. We don't know because we've never invested in that. I mean, here's one person talking about the way financial restitution would be a blessing if it didn't come directly from the rapist, but if the community required him to give back. And in fact, there is such the US does have such a system, which you may be familiar with. This is the Victims of Crime Act, which was passed actually as part of the Ronald Reagan Law and Order program, but you know, tough on crime. But it's actually, I consider, a very progressive piece of legislation, because there's a fund established, a national trust fund, and the states have similar trust funds, that is based on fines on offenders. And that the money is used for three things: for direct victim compensation, for medical expenses or lost time from work, for victim advocacy services in court, and for victim crisis services like rape crisis centers, battered rape women's shelters, and so on. And in fact, and the other progressive thing about it is that survivors sit on the board that allocate the funds. There's an argument that the money should come from taxpayers as well as offenders, since we are implicated bystanders. I think when this sort of restitution, when people receive this kind of response from the community, when they feel that other people share their indignation, their helpless rage can be transformed into righteous indignation. And that's, you know, righteous indignation can be a source of social action, as is clear from your organization. Can be a source of both serving the larger community and affecting change. And people get an enormous sense of pride when they can transform for their horrible experience into a gift to other people. When they speak out, when they say, I'm a survivor, and here's what I think has to happen, there's a kind of alchemy that happens. It doesn't make your post-traumatic stress go away necessarily, but the shame is lifted, and people can begin to feel pride and agency. And a long time ago, Ann Burgess and Linda Holmstrom, a psychiatric nurse and a sociologist, spent a year in the early 1970s being on call to Boston City Hospital. And they saw every rape victim that came into the emergency room. And then they followed up 4 years later. Oh, and they published in 1973 in the American Journal of Psychiatry an article on rape trauma syndrome, in which they said, you know, this looks an awful lot like shell shock and what combat veterans report. We didn't have the diagnosis post-traumatic stress then. That was really, we have to credit the Vietnam veterans against the war for that. But she found that the people who made the best recoveries 4 years later, most of course had gotten no treatment other than what they got in the emergency room, were people who had found social support, talked to other people, gotten support, and who had taken some kind of action to protect themselves in the future. So people who develop this kind of survivor mission tend to do quite well. So that's, why don't we stop there? This is a poster from National Crime Victims' Rights Week. We have a Victims' Rights Week every year. We now have an Office for Victims of Crime in the Justice Department and a National Center for Victims of Crime. And they have a conference every year in Massachusetts at the State House here. And so this was a poster from one of those conferences. And as you see, people want voice, they want choices, they want resources, they want counseling, they want information, advocacy, restitution, and they want justice, they want respect. So, and they want safety, of course. So there you have it. Thank you for your attention. And the floor is, well, now we will have a little discussion first, just the two of us, and then the floor is open for questions.
We haven't really talked about how to have a discussion.
Oh, well, just, whatever occurs to you.
Well, I wanted to say to everyone, if you haven't read this book, read it. It is so well written, and it will touch you so very deeply, and also challenge your ideas about what we could do and additional ways to envision justice. And it's just a marvelous book, and also a very something you can take hold of and move forward with for action. So thank you, Judith. That your work has always been inspiring and helpful, and this is just what we need, because I've been thinking about related to the work I do, and I wanted to ask you, for the people in schools who've been been the target of sexual abuse and sexual misconduct by school employees, so often they're the ones who have to leave, not.
Yes, yes.
And there's, the justice isn't there, and I want to know how to, and the anger toward bystanders, and and I certainly see that among the people I've studied,
Mhm.
in the schools, people who saw things but didn't do anything. How do we get justice in that public way, and also get bystanders involved in not just doing what they're supposed to do, but understanding that there needs to be justice for the harm they've done?
Yes, yes. Well, we see a lot of that, the same kind of problem on college campuses, including my own, where, the administration would much rather just get rid of the problem by getting rid of the victim. Oh, you poor thing, why don't you take a leave of absence for your mental health? Because it's going to be a headache for them.
Yeah.
The last thing they want is a lawsuit. So they want to cover it up. It's really as simple as that. And the only, now that we have Title IX, yeah, supposedly they're supposed to take steps to prevent this, and to do something about it. But in fact, the students will be gone soon. I mean, what they count on is that, the students, if it's a senior or junior, they'll be gone in a couple of years anyway, or
Yeah.
a few months in the case of a senior. And so maybe they can just kind of, make it go away. So I honestly do think that the motivation needs to come from the fact that they're more likely to get a lawsuit if they don't do anything than if they do. Honestly, because they don't want lawsuits.
Right.
That's the motivation. So, I get a lot of calls or emails from time to time. A parent or a friend of a friend, where a kid's been sexually harassed or by faculty, or sexually assaulted by a fellow student, or and it said, and they don't really, again, most of the time they're not that eager to have the perpetrator punished or expelled. But they don't want to have to run into him in the goddamn dining room, excuse my French, or in gym, or in a classroom. And they don't want to run into his friends who are slut shaming them, and so they want accommodations. They want him,
Right.
they want limits placed on him. And there are some colleges that I think have done a good job figuring out some of these informal resolution strategies that use a more educational and restorative approach, and we can talk more about that. But what I advise these people is, if you really want the administration to take action, go to your local Red Crisis Center, report this. Report to the police. Tell them, that you're reporting because you want the university or the school to do something about it. And frankly, they're much more likely to do something about it if it's been reported to the police.
Mhm, mhm.
You know, whether or not it ever goes, you know, I mean, you know, you can then decide later on whether you want to, you know, press charges. But if you're not alone and they see you're not alone and they see you have people behind you, you know, who can hold them accountable, they're much more likely to do the right thing. And I'm sorry that it has to be that way, but that, I think, is the reality.
Yeah. I'm a Title IX hearing officer at our university, and then in many of the cases I've read, one of the problems I find is that again, they isolate the person who's been harmed.
Right.
So they move them away from their friends and move them out to another place. And again, that's just multiplying the harm.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah, it's just so much easier, you know, for them to do that because, you know, if they isolate the offender, they're going to hear from the alumni, they're going to hear from the frat, they're going to hear from the sports team, you know, they're going to have a headache.
Yeah.
So one of the colleges that, or universities that I think has done a beautiful job, and I've written about this in the book, to some degree, although it turns out they've just had a little problem with some coaches that had gone on for years and years and years and years. It's Northwestern. And they have a peer-led education. Both they have very widespread peer education, and they train a bunch of students to be peer educators. And it's not just, you know, don't drink at parties, you know. They do a play, the students put on a play at freshman orientation. Oh, I think my cat wants to participate. Yeah, you can see her in the corner there. Called The Student Body. And they do role plays of actual scenes that survivors have encountered, whether with faculty, whether with other students. And then they have small group discussions. And by the way, there's some studies that show that students who have had that kind of preventive education where they actually practice, then they do role plays themselves and they practice saying no and stuff like that, are less, like half as likely to suffer sexual assault. I mean, prevention really works, but it's not checking a box of, you know, a handout during,
Right.
you know, freshman week. It's ongoing, lots of small group discussion. Oh, they also, they have a little kind of cart that goes around the campus called Find the G-Spot. And they hand out contraceptives and, you know, morning after and pill and do a lot of sex education. And so, and then there's a lot of good educational programs now about consent. There's a book and what consent means, and it's not just a matter of age of consent. It's about power dynamics and whether you are really, if this person is in a position of power over you for whatever reason, then you're not free. Then you to give free informed consent. There's a book called Sexual Citizens that I think is useful, has some useful models. And then the other thing that I think really does need to happen on the educational side is real sex education. And I know with, high school students, you're going to have to work. I don't know how the parents are going to feel about that, but I think you can present it in such a way that this is a safety issue. And most kids get their sex education from porn. And so there has to be a discussion of pornography. And I'm using it in this, Catherine McKinnon sense as the erotization of dominance and subordination. Most pornography is about power over. She says no, 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 but she really means yes, 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 because she really wants to be overpowered. Yeah, right. But that's how a lot of kids get their sex information.
Yeah, yeah.
Most kids, I would say, at this point, with the internet being what it is. So I think you need a very robust educational arm. And then I think you also need good victim support. And one of the things they do at Northwestern, because they have support groups and all that kind of thing, but they also, if a person wants to file an informal complaint, they don't want to file a formal Title IX complaint, they can go to the care center, the victim support center, and they can, the report will be kept confidential, but the faculty, the administration can call in the offender informally and say, there has been a complaint. And we recommend that you engage in a restorative process. The alternative may be a formal complaint. And then they are required to go through a lot of educational stuff. They're required to acknowledge, apologize, and make amends. And they have to think through that, the victim is asked to write basically an impact statement where she says what she would like for amends. And then he has to also come up with some ideas of what he can do to make amends. And they, that kind of informal resolution in some ways, I think it's a good model, because if there, Title IX is becoming more and more, adversarial, and more and more, and the punishment is expulsion. But then he's going to feel like he's the victim, and he's going to go somewhere else and do the same thing. So, while they're still young and educatable, possibly, that's the time to really engage them, I think. And maybe their whole sports team, and maybe their whole fraternity.
Yeah. I also see, like in middle school and high school, that those students don't have support systems, that those schools don't have peer groups to support them. And also they don't, first of all, they don't teach the kids what would be an acceptable and not acceptable behavior from an adult working there. So very often the kids say, well, it must have been okay. We all saw what they were doing and out in the hallway and in front of people. So I guess they were just boyfriend and girlfriend, and
Yeah.
nobody said anything, so it must be fine. So without that kind, and also without training on how to be a bystander.
Right. Well, there is such a thing as bystander
There
intervention training, and it seems to have, I mean, there have been some studies done on outcomes that look promising. So, but I think that, you know, like that would be a beautiful scenario to role play. You
Mhm.
know, how a teacher grooms a kid and how, you know, and makes the kid feel special and and you know, they can spot the ones who are hungry for an adult's, you know, they're away from home, and so again, if you have a good preventive education thing, you can talk about those scenarios,
Right.
and maybe have some people who've been through it talking about how, you know, how it affected them, and you know, how long it took them to figure out that no, this was actually exploitative. This was not, you know, you know, that they were taken advantage of.
Yeah. And I see that more in higher ed than I see it happening in K-12.
Yeah.
You know, I see more, K-12 has very few bystander trainings. They, you know, so a lot of the things that we've seen working in higher ed, I think we need to move them into high school, middle school, elementary school.
Totally, especially residential schools.
Yeah, absolutely.
Would this be a good time to transition to the questions and answers?
Sure.
Thank you, Dr. Herman, and thank you, Dr. Schickschaft, for everything so far. Now, I have these questions. The first ones have been sent in, and there's yes, you're spotlighted, Cheryl, because some of these questions will be
Okay.
might be valid for you, and I have one specifically for you. So I'm hoping we're going to get to it.
Okay.
The first question is, as Exonians, we were asked by our school to commit to the highest standards of personal conduct and academic excellence. The Academy has more resources per student than most other institutions, and many of us would like to see it set an example for modeling a more effective and courageous response to abuse. The Academy seems to be in a cover your backside mode more than taking a progressive and aspirational role in what is obviously a problem well beyond our high school. How might we convince Exeter that we are not seeking punitive damages, but we do expect the school to be responsible for the harm caused under their roof, especially by adults that prey on minors?
Well, I think money talks. I think if they're not, unless and until they come up with something a little more satisfactory, some alumni are going to give to PATH rather than to give to Exeter. But you know, so that's part of it. But I think also that as a group, you can propose some models of what you think they should be doing and could be doing. And I mean, really, it's the research that they should be doing themselves. But the truth is that you're more likely to do it than they are, because you're more motivated. So one place I would look for some interesting models, Jennifer Freud, who's a psychology professor at University of Oregon, has this Institute for Institutional Courage now. She's the one who kind of coined the term institutional betrayal. But now she's gone on to develop these ideas of what is institutional courage. Are you familiar with this? Yeah, okay. And they have some nice examples, I think. I mean, they've been sort of collecting materials about the ways different institutions have been proactive on this. And so that's, I think, one good source of models. And I think that the sort of, I don't know if they're sort of, when they recognize an institution as an example of institutional courage, actually, I think that's a good marketing advantage. I mean, not that Exeter needs a lot of marketing, but you know, why should they choose Exeter over, you know, comparable schools? Well, that might be one reason. And so, you know, I think in terms of offering them some motivation, those two ideas might be useful. I don't know. Carol, Dr. Shakespeare, do you have other thoughts about that?
No, I was just thinking to start if you had an institute at Exeter to help schools across the country,
yeah,
and to provide services and to lead the way, and also to support researchers. This isn't a topic that a lot of funding agencies want to fund.
Yeah.
You know, so but under that kind of leadership, it could be a repository, and can do a lot of good stuff across all kinds of schools in the K through 12 area.
What a great idea.
I want to check, Cheryl, that back when you spoke at Exeter's 50th years of 50 years of coeducation, I asked you if there was a school you could point to that was doing this well, and you said not a single one. Is that
Right.
still the case?
That's still pretty much the case, yeah.
And that's for how many years of study?
Well, I started in the mid-'80s on this topic. No, what happens is everything gets buried. It moves forward. Nothing gets talked about. Nothing gets. Nobody seems to use these awful things as a catalyst to do better, to make changes, to put it out there and say, and these are the things we're going to do so that this never happens again.
And the highlight from Dr. Lewis, Dr. Herman's talk that I want to keep underlining is that it leaves an unsafe campus. It does not attempt to safety.
Absolutely.
I want to move on to more questions. There's plenty here. One, I think you've already answered, but just in case there's more to this. How are statutes of limitation rendering survivor voices ineffective, keeping those who harm able to harm, and I'll leave it at that because I can't make the rest of the sentence out.
Well, you have not only the problem of delayed recall, which affects some survivors, but not most, actually. The dissociative amnesia the earlier in childhood the abuse happens, the more likely people are to, and the longer it goes on, the more likely people are to have dissociative symptoms, including amnesia. Although, I mean, it's also, you see it with other kinds of PTSD as well. But even if they do remember everything clearly, they're not in any emotional condition to come forward for the most part. And for many years, you know, by the time people are recovered enough to really want to feel strong enough to take action, a lot of time has often passed. So, so it is a serious barrier, and you can see that in the states that have paused the statute of limitation, in a window, like New York, given a window for survivors of childhood abuse to come forward, and you know, a lot of people have filed charges. So, but I don't think the statute of limitations alone is the main barrier. I think, you know, the shame and isolation and fear that people experience are also major barriers, and that's why only a small minority of victims ever report.
I just say quickly, there's no statute of limitation for murder, but sexual abuse of children and adults is murder to the soul. So I think we should remember, you know, think how serious the damage is.
Yeah. I just want to say this question because you have answered it. Because there are 14, there's a great questions, and I want to see if we can get to as many as possible. I think this was answered in your talk. You referenced the age of consent as effectively acting as the age of legal exploitation in the justice system. But I and other survivors happen to have been legal adults when abused. Regardless of age, what can be done about consent when it involves positions of power and even dependency, like between a teacher and student?
Yeah, I think we've addressed that, yes.
The next question is, do you think the Phillips Exeter Academy should make a public apology for having forced students to undergo psychiatric conversion therapy in order to cure them of their homosexuality?
Oh, at the very least.
At the very least. The next one's, how can boarding schools best educate students about the signs of grooming and inappropriate detention? And what are some best practices for reporting systems that protect students and provide accountability?
Well, again, I think we've touched on that. You have to talk about it. You have to address it. You have to name it. You have to make it part of the student's education to understand the power imbalance between students and faculty. And that, of course, teenagers have crushes on teachers all the time, you know, and they are very sexy teenagers, and a lot of adults find them attractive, but that's not good enough, you know, and they are not, they're in such an unequal position vis-a-vis faculty that the faculty really have a responsibility to keep that boundary. And if the boundary is starting to get slippery, the students have to know it's safe to tell somebody, and that they will be protected, and they will not be ignored, and they will not be shamed, and people and students will, and that, you know, something will be done about it. And they have to know that's a fact, and that it's not just lip service. And, you know, who can you talk to confidentially, and, you know, like that.
I also think students and adults need training in action. So we need training in order to say, what do you say when you see a colleague do this? What do you say? What do you say when you see a teacher do this? What do you do? Let's act it out. Let's try it out. Because there's a lot of ways you can do it, but most kids and most adults don't really, it doesn't come to them naturally. So yes, we have to teach about the boundaries, of course, but then teach about the actions we have to take to keep people from crossing the boundary or calling them out when they do.
Yeah. So that's bystander intervention training for faculty as well as students.
Yes. The next question is, what are tips for parents to communicate with their students about proper boundaries with teachers and other school adults?
Oh gosh, I mean, you gotta have some frank conversations with your kids about power and control and sex and consent and all those things that aren't so easy for parents and kids to talk about, but you know,
Yeah.
it's better to talk about it than not talk about it.
The next one is, these are all related. How can institutions monitor for possibly inappropriate relationships early on and do so with some accuracy?
Well, I can talk to the K-12. We don't supervise very well. So we don't, people say, oh, I'm an administrator, I supervise, I walk through the building, I do that. We don't look into closed classrooms. We don't check areas where there's no supervision and why people are there. That doesn't happen very often. And so there are a lot of places, especially on a campus, that's a campus as opposed to just a building, and where people board in the place. So we have to have more, in some ways, more intrusive supervision, and also supervision of discussion. I don't want to see this. If we see this, we have to put it out there in words as well as then following up in the physical action of actually supervising what people do. And if you start having people say, well, I saw that these together all alone, then you start to follow up on that. Why are you out here at 10:30 at night alone on the playing field? You know, so I do think we have to be just have to be more intentional.
The next one is not a question, but I think it's worth saying, that this presentation I'm going to name is inclusive of all people, of all genders, trans and cis, and that have experienced abuse and institutional betrayal.
Yes.
And there are specific layers of structural obstacles that each of these populations and each individual's faces in healing. And I think that needs acknowledgement here.
Oh, absolutely. And of course, people in sexual minorities are targeted.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Here's what is sexual misconduct and what proactive measures are available? This is for, what would you suggest as proactive measures to prevent or address or treat it?
I think we talked.
Okay. Here's this was from your, about the rage. What might be some healthy ways to work through violent rage towards assaulters that refuse to acknowledge the damage they have done and refuse to be held accountable and continuously gaslight?
Well, it takes two to gaslight. So if the offender is incorrigible, why do you want the offender in your life? Get him out of your life. That's one way to do it. The other is, I think, what we've talked about before, that rage is something you feel when you're helpless and ashamed. And righteous anger is a different emotion. So find your support system and talk talk about it with people who care, and think about something you can do to take action. And you can transform that rage into a motivation for positive action, and it feels a lot better than helpless rage.
Yeah. Okay, now I have some from the talk. I'm scrolling up and down. I'm disorganized and trying to collect the questions. With regards to the potential role plays you were talking about earlier, are there potential harms to balance that might arise from training children not to trust the adults charged with caring for them? Should we teach children to view as a source of danger any thoughtful teachers who offer support and mentorship and attention when they're away from home? Don't children need trusted adults in their lives, and how to hold that balance?
Of course, people need support and mentorship from adults. It's when the mentorship kind of slides over into physical contact, or first it's a hug, and then it's sort of not just a little friendly hug, but a little more than that. Or the mentorship isn't so much about your ideas and what you've read and what you're thinking about, but has anybody told you how beautiful you are? And
I think that the energy of the question is like, how do we help kids have
what?
how do we help these students who are, teenagers away from home,
Yeah.
have these really positive role model relationships, while we also tell them how to understand the difference between a positive role model and somebody who's
abusing power. Well, again, I think role plays are a wonderful way to do it. You can illustrate what a supportive dialogue with a faculty member looks like, as well as one that's kind of a little sketchy, and what's the difference here? And then you have people discuss how to tell the difference, so that and the good news is most teachers don't abuse their power. You don't have to go around, feeling like, the cornered mouse, with a big cat after you. You can, most of the cats are quite friendly, but within boundaries.
Thank you. Besides reporting to the police or rape crisis center, as you've said, how do you get bystander attention? How do you motivate them to come to the table to reach a resolution, either through restorative justice, monetary settlement, or some combination? In my experience, my clients would be willing to settle for much less, this is from a lawyer, if they believed the institution was supporting them and owning their own responsibility. And the comment underneath that is, I may have to buy a bunch of your books and put a copy in administration's mailboxes.
Well, there's always the media. These folks don't like negative publicity. But it does have to be some sort of outside pressure, I think. One of the things that happened at my institution was the Harvard Crimson published a letter from a survivor, called herself Anonymous. It was addressed to the administration, said, "Dear Harvard, you win." And she described the runaround she got from the administration after she just asked for some, basically a little support.
What about the community? It's I'm just curious. you think the community is strong enough to be internal pressure instead of external pressure?
Well, soon after the Crimson published that letter, I think it helped that we had our first female president at the time, Drew Faust. But she appointed a task force to, she said, you're absolutely right, we are not. By that time, of course, there were also some Title IX lawsuits, and Harvard was found not in compliance with Title IX. And she appointed this committee that I thought, oh yeah, right, appoint a committee, But they actually proposed some very strong institutional reforms. So it can be done.
I have another question. You had suggested that survivors report informally instances of a sexual assault abuse to school support organizations or the police. How does mandatory reporting requirements come into play in an informal reporting scenario?
It's a big problem. It's one of the big problems with mandatory reporting. It actually becomes an obstacle if students can't have a confidential route. I don't know all the legalities of this, but I think if it's within a counseling center, you have, therapist-client confidentiality. So, if you can base your informal, your informal track in a counseling center, that might be a sufficient protection. I just don't know.
I just want to say, I think there are differences, though, between mandatory reporting issues in higher ed and K through 12. And so that the two settings have, different parameters, maybe different boundaries.
That is true.
Yeah. In this scenario, we're most of us, well, no, I don't know. I'm sure there are people here who are interested, but I also want to, for the Exeter situation, it is for and making suggestions to our school, we would be looking at mandatory reporting.
Yes, you'd have to do that.
Because even for minors, even therapists are mandatory reporters.
That's right. But the thing about mandatory reporting is a lot of the bystanders don't report, because they think they have to know for sure and have actually seen some sexual act or something, So the misconceptions about mandatory reporting in K through 12 are still problematic. We still need to work on that.
Yeah, because you are required to report if you suspect.
Yes.
You do not have to have proof, and you are indemnified against any lawsuits. That's the other thing people worry about. If you report, failure to report is, a violation. But if you report, you don't have to have proof, and you just have to have suspicion.
Yeah, so I don't think
are not mandated reporters can also report anonymously.
Right.
Yeah. So it sounds the answer is it is a conundrum, and mandatory reporting has kind of positive and negative consequences.
Well, in some ways, in K through 12, it's one of the few support systems we have.
Yeah.
I mean, I know, I understand the issues in higher ed, and I understand that they can be the same issues in K-12, but I also think that it's one of the few things that that we have in that kind of school system. Also, I would say anonymous reporting, you know, is useful. People can people may report things anonymously, and so many places won't allow that.
Yes, and the thing is that the Child Protective Services keep records of the reports. So if you report anonymously, you don't know how many other reports
Right.
have been filed. And, you know, at a certain point, if they have more than one report, hopefully they are going to investigate.
Yeah.
And then there's a question. Based on your experience, do you have advice for survivors of sexual abuse in K through 12 who are considering bringing a claim? This is a person in Maryland that has abolished the statute of limitations.
Well, I've seen a lot of K through 12 claims come forward across the states have abolished, and in the people I've worked with, the experience is in some cases very transformational. Finally, you get to be that person who can speak out. At one time, you might not have spoken out because you were a child and you didn't know what to do. And then you weren't allowed to speak out because of the statutes of limitations. And so I've experienced people who brought the suits in this time when you can, as feeling empowered and feeling good about themselves, even when sometimes the civil suit didn't go in didn't go the way they might have wanted it to. They still felt good because they felt strong, because they were strong. They stood up, and every person who stands up helps all those other people.
I would just advise people who are going to do that, have a good support system.
Yes.
Make sure you know who your buddies are, your posse, and maybe take a self-defense class.
Yeah. I have another comment about just that there are real differences in implications for people in K through 12 or 9th grade through 12th grade. These are very different ages and stages of development.
Yeah.
Even between a 9th grader and a 12th grader.
Yes, absolutely.
And then this is moving to Title 9, which is less about Exeter, but could you talk a little about Title 9 and how to use it in cases of school sexual assault? And my understanding is Exeter is not a school where Title 9 applies.
Well, I think that is, I don't have good, I think it's very variable. So I don't have a good generalizations. And the other thing that's been going on with Title IX is that under the Obama administration, there was a lot of active enforcement. Then when Trump came in, he gutted it. You know, his Secretary of Education basically tried to make it as difficult as possible to file a Title IX complaint and put all kinds of obstacles in the way of any kind of Title IX enforcement. And then now under the Biden administration, they're trying to restore what they had under the Obama administration. So there's a whole bunch of new regs that are out for comment that, you know, there's a long process of changing the regs. So,
and by regs, you mean regulations, right?
The regulations, sorry. Yeah.
Right. So I'd say if you don't receive any federal funds, you're not covered by Title IX. Although if during the pandemic you got federal funds through some of those programs for for institutions that didn't normally receive federal funds but got pandemic federal funds, you now are under Title IX, and so that's kind of a trade-off. But Title IX, you know, gives you a way to make a complaint. But in many cases, the resolutions are not very satisfying under Title IX.
It's still an adversarial process.
Yeah, it's adversarial, and there's not a lot of the peer-to-peer Title IX cases are more likely to have a kind of restorative justice approach, but the adult to child don't have that part in them. There's not really a place for it.
And I want to clarify, in the restorative justice approach, it's not necessarily victim offender. It's reconciliation with an institution, for example, or reconciliation with the community.
Yes, right.
Which seems to be more powerful and more valuable in the end.
I agree.
According to research.
Yeah, I agree.
Totally, yeah. Also, you know, you can file a civil lawsuit in court rather than a Title IX. A Title IX complaint goes to the Department of Education, basically. A civil suit goes to civil court. So even for institutions that where Title IX is not applicable, the civil lawsuit route is available.
The one difference is when the Title IX complaint does go to the federal to the Office of Civil Rights, they make the institution do restorative things.
Yes.
A civil case usually doesn't make the institution do anything, but it could. That could be part of all settlements. That could be every settlement could have a restorative feature in it that would address the institutional actions moving forward. And if we could only get, you know, attorneys and others to add that to the settlement package, it would do so much good.
I did miss a question that had been sent in that I want to make sure we answer. A female classmate at UPenn my freshman year in 1979 was having a relationship with a young male Exeter teacher. At the time, I shrugged it off as none of my business. But later it occurred to me that my classmate probably had an inappropriate relationship with this male teacher while a student at Exeter. What action, if any, should I have taken at the time?
Let Exeter know.
Yeah. Say, I'm concerned that there's a teacher there that was having, you know, sexual relationships with a student while the person was a student.
This would be the bystander situation.
Yeah, bystander.
It's a lot of pressure on young people to take. It's a huge responsibility.
It's a huge responsibility because that person's their friend, and the friend would be furious at this point, probably, or maybe relieved. You know, you don't know all the pieces to it, but it's
oh, you don't know.
It's very vexed.
Yes. Friend. You can say, you know, was this going on when you were still, you know, a high school student? Because, you know, that's not kosher.
Yeah. And then, of course, is the question of the.
But I love him.
Yeah, and then whether and that entanglement and whether there would be a clean reporting, and is this adult going to do it to somebody else when this relationship ends? It's very complex. It's very complex.
But you can, I mean, you're sharing your concern. You're not filing a lawsuit.
No.
You're just simply speaking up. But you have taken, it's better than just standing by and looking the other way.
So that would be the recommended action would be to say something, even if it was against what your friend wanted to say, even if it was uncomfortable, because in the end, that is the action of the bystander that's necessary.
And again, I think that's the kind of scenario you can play out
Mhm.
in a role play, and then have a whole group of students talk about, well, what should we do? You
Yeah.
know.
Yes. I have another comment. The agency of the adult survivor and the potential putting of them at the center of a law enforcement investigation also matters. I'm I'm not sure if I'm connecting it to the right statement. If the person who wrote that, if you could just say a little bit more, I might be able to connect it in better. Because I value the comments. Yeah, this is about reporting about a friend. Yes, that the person making that suggestion might end up having recrimination happen to them for saying anything at all.
Yeah, that's possible.
Yeah. So that would be a huge ecology to, to not say anything out of the fear of having something come back at you. It's not it's about to say that it may not always be the right move to transgress someone's trust and re-traumatize them as an argument not to report for the sake of protecting the person who was abused. Yeah, they might not be ready for that.
Right.
It
Yeah,
goes
but
back to
that
role
really,
playing. The scenario would bring about all kinds of ways that we're doing actually right now. We're having the what ifs
right,
and complexity
exactly.
pushed out.
Yeah. On the other hand, are you in a position to judge
Hmm.
whether you are being protected, whether silence is protection for that person?
Yes. It sounds like it'd be a very rich role play with lots of important it is important aspects. And at Exeter, we have had scenarios like this play out that have been very complex and very painful to survivors and the community as a whole. So I want to name that too.
Yeah.
We're coming to the end. I think we've gotten through all our questions. I hope I haven't missed one. If anyone is here and I've missed your question, this would be the time to send a chat to me right now. I really, really appreciate this this whole 2 hours and all that you had to present, Dr. Herman, and the discussion you had, Dr. Shakeshaft with Dr. Herman, and just really rich questions from this community. And I hope everyone here found it valuable. I hope those who will listen to this later will also find it valuable, and I hope it will be valuable to our whole community and our school.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for this opportunity. Yes, I learned a lot.
Well,
Take care, everyone.
is there any last things either of you want to say? No?
I think we've covered the topic.
Yes. It's so appreciated.
Have a good evening, everyone.
Yeah. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a good night. Thank you for coming.